the greatest commandment is to love God, to love one another. Relating is part of that. So I think that's a challenge we're going to have to wrestle with. What are our habits of how do we use technology well? What can we affirm about it, but what do we need to critique about it? What kind of habits do we need to form? What kind of rule of life do we need to have around technology, not just phones, but also what we watch, TV, all that kind of stuff. I think the other challenge is the attack on our identity now. We see that across the board. Our culture has particular ideologies around identity that you define yourself. And so it's the question, who am I?
Hello, folks. Welcome to the Disciple Dilemma. I'm Dennis Allen. The name of the talk today is An Aussie Talks About the Brits with an American. We're talking to Natasha Tash. She goes by Tash Edwards today. Tash is a theologian and a musician. Her undergraduate degree in music from the prestigious Queensland Conservatorium. And she has a master's degree from the London School of Theology. She served as a youth pastor and a training team leader in Australia until she and her husband Simon moved from Australia to Oxford in 2011, where they live today along with their 3 children. Tash serves as the honorary chaplain to Christians in Government in London. But our reason for the podcast today is that Tash is the pastor of Discipleship and Communities at Latimer Church in Beaconsfield, England, near Oxford, which is precisely why we wanted to talk to her. They're up to some fascinating things around discipleship, around leadership that's helping to shape discipleship, and that's why we wanted to visit with her today. Tash, we are so amped to have you here on the Disciple Dilemma. Thank you for being a part of our podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dennis. I'm really looking forward to our time together today.
We are too, because now for the first time we have got in the crosshairs. I maybe shouldn't say crosshairs. We have right here on the camera a magnificent pastor and musician, a mom, a theologian whose job title is discipleship. And this is gonna be great. Would you kind of take us on a walk of what does that mean? Where are you serving? What's it look like?
Yeah, so I'm the pastor for Discipleship and Communities at a church called Latimer Church here in England. We are based in between London and Oxford in a place called Beaconsfield, but we are quite geographically spread in terms of a congregation. The church has been around for a while, probably for about 10 years, and I've been involved right from the early stages of it, being a church plant. And in the last couple of years, it's gone through a bit of a transition. And so we have the luxury of not actually having a church building at the moment. So we are slightly homeless, but that's a good thing because it gives us some opportunities to think about how we do church together and what our model of church is. We exist, our vision, if you like, as a church is to unleash God's people to be fruitful in the world. And so the way that we hope to do that is by cultivating 4 pillars in the life of our church, which is encountering God, experiencing community, embracing our callings, and engaging the world. And so everything that we do, we're trying to cultivate these 4 pillars because we believe if we grow those, and each of us as individuals are growing in those 4 areas, then we will become people that are unleashed in the world. So that's a little bit about us. We do have a very different kind of model or rhythm of meeting to take those 4 E's seriously. So one of the things that we've been experimenting with is meeting in homes on the first Sunday of the month. So we've put everyone into smaller communities. I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about this a little bit later, potentially. I think you're going to ask me a bit more about it. But really what we're trying to do in this model by having every single person in a smaller community in a home is we're trying to take seriously this E that we want to experience community together, but actually our experience of community is really important in terms of what it means to be the church in the world. So Yeah, so it's a little bit of an experiment that we're undertaking to see, is there fruit to be gained by actually doing smaller church once a month and then meeting all together and doing larger church. Um, but I can share a little bit more about that maybe a bit later.
What would you say the average church attending person in the UK would think about what you just talked about, this small group community thing? Are they going to say, "Oh yeah, that's totally normal for us," or are they going to look at you like, "What are you doing? How normal is that?"
Do you know that there's a number of people experimenting with this, I think, across the UK, but it is still quite it's a foreign concept for people. So we're about 2 years into this. We started doing this during COVID, actually, where we put everyone into a mid-sized community. We started meeting in homes because at that time you couldn't meet in churches anyway, so it afforded a way for us to meet in smaller ways, smaller gatherings. And so the responses have been mixed. Some people absolutely love it, and they're like, I love this, I feel I'm known, I'm seen, I'm serving. And for other people, it's been a real challenge. It's been quite a challenge to their sort of preconceived idea of what church is and what do we do when we gather together in church. So I suspect for a lot of people, it's a bit of a foreign concept, and it does have its challenges. It's quite a confronting model because you can't just go along on a Sunday and not be seen. You have to commit to a group of people, which actually that's a challenge in and of itself. So yeah, so there's been mixed responses to it, I'd have to say.
If you were to think about Latimer Church, named of course Latimer and Ridley are very famous figures in history as we think back to the Reformation. If you think about Latimer Church as an aggregate, how many people would you say sort of collect or attend the aggregate Latimer?
So we have probably about 150, including children. So we're not a large church at this stage. Do you mean as a whole? As a
As a
whole?
whole?
Yeah, there's about 150 of us that gather as
Lovely.
a whole. Yeah.
That's lovely. And then so you use the term mid-sized and small. Would you stage those for us so we get a sense of that?
Yeah, so when I talk about the communities as being mid-sized communities, the reason I use that word is to try and get away again from the preconceived idea of small groups. Because often when people think about small groups, they think about maybe 6 to 12 people. But mid-sized communities are more about 25 to 30 in the community, and they have a slightly different role to play than, say, the small group does. Often our small groups become very insular, and that's great, and it's necessary. It's good to have friends that we are intimate with and vulnerable with. But then when you come to the larger gathering, you have 150 people meeting there, it can be very easy to get lost in that larger gathering. And also you can just come and receive, but not have to give anything. The idea of mid-sized community is to actually provide a space to be seen and known, but also to serve other people that might not be like you. And again, this is one of the challenges, of small groups. Small groups tend towards gathering people that are just like you, just exactly the same. But actually, that it doesn't exercise love muscle, if you like. The challenge to us to love others as ourselves. You actually have to learn to love people that are not like you, and to do life with people that are not like you. And so part of that hope with these mid-sized communities is it gives an opportunity to get to know people that are not like you. And also with the emphasis on being intergenerational. Again, that's about learning from people in different ages and stages of life. The other idea behind these communities is that they would remain open and hospitable. Often, again, small groups become closed by their very nature. And so they're not open to growth. Whereas the advantage of having mid-sized communities is as they grow, then new communities can bud out from them. So they're just one area of discipleship, if you like. They're one aspect to our model of discipleship. If you think of discipleship as an ecosystem, we're creating an ecosystem where life might be cultivated. So part of that is the larger gathering, which is the space where we come and we worship and we encounter God and we hear God's word and we get trained and equipped. The mid-sized communities are where we share life together, we understand each other's context, we get to practice the ministry of the priesthood of all believers, we get to encourage each other, we get to explore our spiritual gifts in that context as well. And then there is the need for a smaller context where we actually have spiritual friends who really know the deep, deep part of us, who are challenging us in those deeper parts. So that's a sort of idea of trying to build an ecosystem of discipleship, different contexts that play different, that have different roles in our in the growth and maturing of us to become more like Christ. So yeah, that's the whole idea behind it.
So just for the sake of emphasis here, when you talk about the smallest of the groups, how many people do you envision being connected together in one of those cells?
Yeah, in an ideal, I would say 3 people. And the reason I say 3 people is, well, because Jesus did that, obviously. He had his kind of 3. But also, something significant happens when you have 3 people. When you have 2 people meeting together, that's great as well. But something else happens when you've got a third person who witnesses the relating between 2 other people. There's the interesting dynamic that's at play. 2 people can also have a tendency towards collusion. In other words, they can reinforce each other's sin, whereas a third person can bring some objectivity to it. So in an ideal world, I would say something like prayer triplets would be the best thing to go for. There's something significant about that in terms of 3 coming together, sharing life in a more deeper way, getting to the deeper stuff in our life.
Folks, when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation with Pastor Tash Edwards, the head of Discipleship and Community at Latimer Church, Beaconsfield, England. This is a great conversation about biblical discipleship lived out in a church. When we come back, we're going to explore with Tash the idea of what the average person in the pew thinks discipleship is before we get on with the oughts of biblical disciple making. In your experience in England, you and Simon have been in the UK now since 2011, so about 11 years. So I'm just going to consider you an expert. Here we go. If you walk around the average congregation on the average Sunday and you sit down with somebody on a microphone, you stick it in their face and you say, tell me about discipleship, what will you hear from the average person around there, your experience?
Yeah. So I think for a lot of people, it's the church experience is their discipleship. So the Sunday worship experience, and this sense of, I go to church and I feel good and I walk away feeling good. But there's sort of this gap in connecting what happens on a Sunday with what happens Monday to Saturday, with every day of my life. What does it look like for me to follow Jesus in every single context and relationship and role and responsibility that I carry in my everyday life? And so there's a slight disconnect there for that. I think the other thing is people are heavily dependent upon the pastor at the front to deliver their discipleship instead of actually going to Jesus as their shepherd, as the one who is leading them through life. And so there would be a bit of a gap in terms of well, certainly I've noticed this in the UK, people don't know how to read the Bible very well. They probably don't think it's very relevant to their life, let alone authoritative for their life. And that's definitely been something that I've noticed over here. So they don't necessarily think of the Bible as playing a role in their everyday life in terms of offering wisdom or guidance as how to live faithfully following Jesus every day.
We have to make this statement pretty often because we're concerned about the wrong perception on the disciple dilemma, and that is that we are cheering for pastors, we are cheering for churches. There is no effort, intent, or implication that we're trying to say, well, the pastors got it all wrong, and they're a bunch of celebrities, and they're just trying to do agency theory and sustain their organizations and so on. We absolutely endorse, affirm, and support the idea that only in Christ's church do we move the body of Christ's people forward. So my question really for you at this point, Tash, is what's it feel like to have people look to you to be the dispenser of discipleship? What kind of a load does that put on ministers, pastors, and staff when that's the mentality?
Yeah, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, really, isn't it? For me personally, because it feels as though I have to play into a performance culture. I have to perform in order to have a role here. And that's a disaster for me spiritually and for my sense of identity. But I think also just thinking about that question, what's it like for me? It's also sad because actually my hope is that everybody sees the part that they have to play in making disciples. It's not just on me, it's on the whole church. If we take seriously Jesus's mandate, which is to go therefore and make disciples of all nations, it's part of our calling, of each of our callings. And so I see my role as to help you or this person discover what aspect of discipleship are you to play into? What part of the process are you to be involved in? And actually, as you play that part, you're going to experience something of the joy of the Lord in that, because that's what you're made for. That's what you're called to. So mind you, I think different people have different roles to play in it, and they have different giftings that play into that. But each of us have a part to play in investing in people and encouraging them in the ways of the Lord, and challenging them as well in terms of, you need to line your life up. You're getting off track. Come back to Jesus. So it's a lot to expect for one person to do that. And so I certainly don't see that as my role. Rather, I see my role as to cultivate context and experiences so that people can grow in being discipled, but also in them disciple making as well. So, yeah.
In the larger context of England, do you find there's an expectation that church is more of a concierge event? I come in, I catch a nice talk, check the kids perhaps into Sunday school, relax a bit, and then head out. Is that generally true? I hate to ask general questions, but is that generally true, or do you find most people who attend church in the UK are there intentionally and seriously for the calling of the ecclesia? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it is generally true, Dennis. I mean, my experience of our church is wonderful because of what we've gone through and the model that we've adopted. We actually have serious people who are seriously committed. So there's this wonderful culture that's forming in our church. But yeah, I think generally that's true. And you see that with church attendance. They say it's now 1 in 4 that most people attend church. There was quite a mass exodus after COVID. And if you think about that, if if you reduce church to an experience, to simply an experience, and I would say the worship experience is the thing over here that people love, this sort of feeling good in the worship experience. If you reduce church to simply an experience, then why would you get off the couch to come to church? Because actually you could just hop online now. You know, you could just live stream that experience into your living room. It's a bit like, you know, going to the cinema or just live streaming on Amazon Prime. Why bother going to the cinema to sit on a couch and watch something when you could just watch it at home? And I think that's been part of what churches have realized through COVID and streaming their services, is that people just looked at church as an experience. And therefore, why would I ever turn up to a building when I could just watch it from the comfort of my own living room? Now, I think as Christians, we know that church is more than that. It's more than just an experience. It's a community of people that I commit myself to, because we're learning to love. We're learning to love each other. We're learning to love the world. We're learning to love our enemies. And that's an expression of our love of God. So I think that's definitely true more generally, and what we've seen happen coming out of COVID, because people don't have this idea of church being a community that I commit to, then they've just opted out.
When you and I were talking about this podcast earlier, we were chatting about your thoughts around what you called step down. You were beginning the staging or the stepping down from large, mid, small. How are you approaching people with the idea of the step down? How are they feeling it, sensing it, and seeing it amongst your communities?
Yeah, most people are okay with it. It's quite fascinating to me how actually for a lot of people, they don't mind you putting them into a community. And because you know, in some ways, when we started this, I just put people into communities and you know, told them this is where you're placed. And so I was wondering how's that going to go? How are people going to respond to that? But, you know, people have responded really well, actually, of knowing that they have somewhere to go, and a group of people that will embrace them. I think the ultimate challenge about that is the leaders themselves of those communities. So I place quite a high premium on looking after those leaders and training them and spending time with them. In fact, that's probably one of the primary aspects of my role, is equipping those leaders, because those leaders now have to deal with relational dynamics. They have to cultivate the sort of culture in the community itself. They have to deal with people that are not, you know, that are tricky, because people are tricky and everyone has their own pain, don't they, their own wounds. And so learning how to navigate that is hard. They have to deal with children in the home. They have to deal with, you know, often cramped houses, because our houses are a bit smaller in England than in the US. And so just the practicalities of sharing a meal together. So I spend quite a bit of time with those leaders, and I have a phenomenal bunch of very gifted and wonderful leaders who give so much of themselves to the body, which is amazing. But and so what I would say is it all hinges on those leaders doing a fantastic job of helping everybody find their fit. But so far it's been okay. It's been okay. You get a little bit of flux between community groups, and that's okay. I'm quite sympathetic to people who are at different, who have particular needs, whether it be a life stage or you know, particular struggles that they're dealing with. And so trying to deal with the individuals as well and help them find a fit. So it's been okay so far. I think the next stage for us to roll out is thinking about how to take it that step down further to, you know, real deep relating through spiritual friendship. So the 2s and 3s, how do you help people find their prayer triplet, that's a slightly different kind of thing, because I don't think that's something that I can put people into. They have to opt in to that kind of sharing, because actually that level of sharing requires trust, and it requires commitment. So just thinking about how to roll that out next and build a culture around that is probably the next stage for me.
So I'm just doing the organizational math on the mid-size. If you've got roughly 150 people and you think roughly 10 might be in a mid group, that's sort of a dozen to 15 folks that you really have sort of a direct connect to right now as leaders who need to be prepared to be leaders in those worlds. Is that the ballpark?
Yeah. So actually, it's more like, I think we have 7 communities, but we have about 25 people in those communities.
Hmm.
And each
Okay.
community has 2 sets of leaders. So each community is led by 2 sets of couples who are the core leadership team of each of those. And so I invest in those leaders. So we meet together every couple of months for training and equipping. And then I meet with them individually for one-to-one coaching and discipleship, seeing how they're going, checking in with them. So that's sort of how we run things organizationally.
Tash Edwards, what a marvelous conversation you have offered us today. Thank you so much for being part of the Disciple Dilemma.
Well, thanks for having me, Dennis. It's been a wonderful delight and such a blessing to me. So thanks for having me.
Tash, if folks wanted to see what's going on at Latimer from afar, even though we're over here stateside perhaps, or in other countries, where would we look to see what you're up to and what Latimer's up to?
Yeah, you can visit www.latimerchurch.org if you want. And we have a YouTube channel as well. You can hop on there, or you can just email me. I would love to receive any questions or thoughts. And so my email is tash.edwards@latimerchurch.org.
Folks, we're just asking all of you to think about the fact that discipleship has, in many respects, been avalanched or eclipsed by some parts of the culture that have pushed it away from the more biblical model Christ gave us. And we've heard Tash talk today about how much it has forced us into large group is it. And Tash's rebuttal to that was some very thoughtful ideas, both about what the fuller biblical model of discipleship is all about, as well as some of the pressures and challenges that are facing all of us as disciples today. So please pass this on to your friends and help us get the word out that discipleship has been hacked, so that we can, in the digital space, talk to folks a little bit more and get them interested in talking to us in the physical space about the reality of who Christ is. As always, thanks for listening.